Now this is the result of, well, around about 2 years of work. But before we take a closer look at it, I feel like it's a much better starting point to take a look at its predecessor. The glow-in-the-dark Max Bow Mark IV. So about 2 years ago is the time when I got my first 3D printer. I've been working with 3D printing in some sense for about 7 years by now, but it was more in a work capacity. You know, I used to do engineering management and especially R&D. And when you do that, you kind of come into contact with it quite naturally, but I never had one for myself. So, you know, it was COVID time, it was a lockdown, the days were getting dark, it was I think November actually. And I figured, you know, what the heck, just get one. And after a couple of small projects, I just wanted to start working on something bigger. The project that I came up with was creating a crossbow, but a crossbow toy that my niece and nephew could, similar to a Nerf gun, you know, just fool around with in the garden a little bit. On top of that, because 3D printing was always about materializing from the cyberspace into reality, I kind of wanted it to be just 3D printed. You know, like you can just turn on the printer, come back the next day, and you have a complete crossbow in the printer good to use. Now, I didn't quite succeed at that, but I think right now I'm at like 99.8%, and it is not a child's toy anymore. I have to say that quite clearly. I'll get to that in a little bit in this video, but it's what got me started onto this journey, adventure, however you want to call it. And one more thing, when I started working on this, I kind of wanted to learn how to do this naturally, kind of like have an idea, try it out, and then keep evolving on it, kind of brute forcing my way through. Because I figured, okay, it would take out quite a bit of the mystery to just look up how does it work. I wanted to have the experience that people from the past had, where they would always just have to keep on improving on ideas to hopefully get somewhere that works. And that's, well, basically it for the starting of this project. I'll be doing this in a two-part video. The first one will revolve around the creation of, well, this fella here. And the second part about the thing that you saw in the intro. Have fun. The first design was, well, relatively simple. It was consisted of about 7 parts, and it was a left and right half with a trigger in the middle and a slat on top, you know, held together by the bow itself. And the firing mechanism would really just push up the slat, release it, which would then, you know, push a potential projectile forward. And here you can see how well that design just did not work. Like, not at all. So in the end, I chose to bury that design. Something would just always break, and most of the time when it broke, actually, you know, injure me a little bit and getting minor scratches or something like that. And it was just fundamentally flawed because that slat would always crash into the front and transfer a lot of kinetic energy into the front, and, you know, causing it to burst. And because it was consisting of those few big components, I would always have to reprint so much of it. Just because something broke off, and I kind of felt like, okay, that's just super wasteful. So let's try a different approach where we make it consist out of a whole lot smaller components that reprint faster. Yeah, no, we're not even going to talk about that one. That one was just wrong. The Mark III was the point at which I actually started to see, well, a little bit of progress, though also consisting of about 7 parts,
They were all in all much smaller, and whenever something broke, I didn't have to reprint the entire thing. The way the fire mechanism worked here was basically once you pull the trigger, a sort of firing pin gets pushed down, which then releases the bowstring, which would then accelerate a projectile. And while this one worked much better, as you can see, it also had its, let's call it, issues.
Now that version already worked a whole lot better. It did what it was supposed to do. It could shoot bolts. Even I think back then I was about 10 pounds. No, I think I was about 15 pounds in draw weight. Not much compared to a real crossbow, but still. But the biggest issue with it was the firing mechanism. You'd always have to pull on the trigger pretty much as strong as the bowstring was pulling on that little firing pin that you saw in the animation. So because I'd already invested a lot of time and, well, a lot of filament, and that was the biggest concern for me at this point, I figured, okay, just for once, look at a historic example on how a firing mechanism or release mechanism used to work, just to take at least a little shortcut in its design.
After a little bit of research, what I found out was that the release mechanisms were just stupid simple back then. Essentially, the bowstring is inside a notch, and by pressing the trigger, you push up the bowstring, which, well, releases the bowstring and enables it to shoot forward. Now, actually having some sort of idea as to how it should work, I just took the Mark III design and improved upon it. I'm still having now around about 8 components, but reworking the trigger. So now the trigger would just push out the string from behind a notch, so it gets released and the bolt can be accelerated.
Now at that point I figured, all right, that's it, you're done. I really just figured, okay, you're good. And it was that time that a friend of mine asked me, can you print one for me, because I want to fool around with it a little bit at home. And I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And I had some glow-in-the-dark filament laying around, which I then used to print his version, and it looked pretty kick-ass. And I figured, hey, maybe you can print one or create one, now of course not just 3D printed, but with electronics, that actually glows in the dark and could shoot glowing crossbow bolts. Now, I don't know anything about electronics, still don't, but looking up a couple of videos on YouTube as to how you basically just have to solder a battery onto the LEDs, I figured you can do that. So I did. And that was that. Well, I wanted it to be that. This Mark IV here, I was quite satisfied with. I mean, this one's now a year old and it's still working. You can't see it glow as much because it's quite bright right now, but I was happy with it. I mean, there was a lot of work. In this video, I've been mostly talking about the firing mechanism, but getting the bow to a point where it doesn't snap after 2 or 3 shots, getting the components to actually be able to deal with the forces that go into them while shooting was a lot of work. The bolts, oh my god, don't get me started on those tiny asses here, was a nightmare to get them to work properly. I did in the end, and I was like, okay, I'm satisfied. But I guess to some extent, engineers gotta engineer. And my mind kept coming back to this project and thinking about, okay, maybe you can do it better. Maybe you can do it with less components. Maybe you can make it so it doesn't sound like that, but sound more solid. And after a while, I started working on it again, much to the disliking of my girlfriend. But yeah, I kind of got into it again, and that spawned, well, this guy right here. Then also there was, you know, this dude right here. And, well, this one here with actually 3-bolt magazine. And last but not least, and that is the one from the intro video, the 50-pound draw weight, 99.8% 3D printed, very reliable and very easy firing pistol crossbow. But how I got here, I'll tell you guys in the second video. I hope you like this one. Please leave a comment down below and hopefully subscribe. And well, see you in the second part.